Gaius Octavius was only 19 years old when his great-uncle Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. And we're going to talk about how this teenager eventually became the first emperor of Rome. But first, we have to set the stage a bit. Before we get started, make sure you like and subscribe for more content like this. Before Caesar's death, Octavius had been a relatively unknown member of the Julian family. He was around for some of the major events of the late Republic, but always on the sidelines. Octavius, as he was known at this time, had been studying rhetoric and military tactics in Apollonia when he received the news that Caesar had been murdered. Then, shortly after, he learned something that would change his life forever. Caesar's will had been read, and in it, Caesar had posthumously adopted Octavius as his son and named him as his primary heir. This was huge. As you can imagine, this was a bombshell announcement, and it would become the obsession of the political class. Caesar's closest ally, Mark Antony, who was serving as consul at the time, was furious about this development. This seems understandable to us, and it seemed understandable to people at the time, but Antony had expected to inherit Caesar's political legacy, and apparently Caesar was more interested in securing his family line than rewarding his most loyal friend. Octavius's whole strategy was to immediately claim his inheritance and take on Caesar's name. Cicero was one of the only prominent senators willing to support this young man publicly. Antony saw this as a threat, and he wouldn't forget it. Against all odds, Octavius managed to secure significant support from Caesar's veterans. Word is that both his family connections and his willingness to pay out Caesar's promised bonuses from his own pocket won them over. The support was just as surprising as the inheritance itself. Anyway, let's jump ahead. Octavius would go on to be elected to a special military command and would receive recognition from the Senate as a result. During Antony's tumultuous year in 44 BCE, Octavius got it into his head that he wanted to be recognized as Caesar's legitimate heir. Why? Here's my theory. The system for political advancement in Rome was heavily weighted towards experienced politicians and military commanders. These people were skeptical of Octavius because of his age and inexperience. He was still decades away from being eligible for consul, but he needed to build up his credibility if he wanted to stand a chance. Plus, we shouldn't overlook the fact that Caesar's assassination in 44 was a big turning point for the reform faction. They had lost their greatest leader, and Octavius was eager to fill that vacuum and continue Caesar's populist legacy. But there was one catch. Octavius was just a teenager with no military experience, and was therefore seen as completely unqualified to lead. The hint was in everyone's reactions. People actually had to take him seriously as Caesar's son. So with the help of Cicero and other anti-Antony senators, Octavius came up with a strategy to gain legitimacy. He started calling himself Gaius Julius Caesar, taking on his adoptive father's full name, though historians call him Octavian during this period to avoid confusion. The whole thing seemed presumptuous to many. His claim to leadership rested entirely on a name. To show off his new status as Caesar's heir, Octavian began recruiting Caesar's veterans and immediately positioned himself as Antony's chief rival. He succeeded. I've mentioned this before, but the political situation in Rome after Caesar's death was incredibly chaotic, so Octavian got to take advantage of the confusion and uncertainty. The first notable thing he did, and we can now recognize the full importance of this act, was to align himself with the Senate against Mark Antony. Octavian wanted to position himself publicly as a defender of the Republic, and opposing Antony was a great way to do just that. Octavian came in with a full understanding of what he needed to accomplish, very ambitious for a 19-year-old. First, he worked with the Senate to have Antony declared a public enemy. You can just imagine how this drove Antony's supporters crazy. The Senate had been trying to reassert control after Caesar's dictatorship. I guess they thought they could use Octavian as their tool. After the Senate gave Octavian military authority, he commanded troops in battle against Antony at Mutina. The battle was technically a victory for the Senate's forces, but both consuls died in the fighting, leaving Octavian as the sole commander. Cicero had supported giving Octavian this command, just like he had supported recognizing him as Caesar's heir. But with the consuls dead, Cicero didn't have enough influence to control what happened next. Octavian turned on the Senate. Here's what happened. Octavian marched his 8 legions back to Rome and demanded to be made consul, even though he was decades too young for the position. The Senate, staring down the barrels of Octavian's army, had no choice. They gave in. Octavian became consul at age 19, the youngest in Roman history. Then Octavian did something that shocked everyone. Instead of continuing his war against Antony, he met with him and another powerful general named Lepidus. The three men formed what would become known as the Second Triumvirate. This wasn't an informal alliance like the one between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. This was an official government position, legally sanctioned by the Senate. The Triumvirate was given extraordinary powers for 5 years to restore the Republic. What this really meant was that three men would rule Rome as dictators. The first thing the Triumvirate did was to issue proscriptions. This is one of the darkest chapters in Roman history, so let me explain what this means. Proscriptions were essentially death lists. The triumvirs would post names of their political enemies in the forum, and anyone could kill these people and claim a reward. It was legalized murder on a massive scale. Hundreds of senators and thousands of equestrians were killed. Their property was confiscated to fund the triumvirs' armies. Cicero was on the list. Antony had never forgiven him for his support of Octavian, and more importantly, Cicero had delivered a series of speeches called the Philippics attacking Antony after Caesar's death. Octavian had tried to protect Cicero, or at least that's what he claimed later, but Antony insisted. Cicero was hunted down and killed. His head and hands were cut off and displayed in the Forum. It was a brutal end for Rome's greatest orator. Like many Romans, Cicero had underestimated how ruthless these young leaders would be. But the Triumvirate's opponents had one more card to play. Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, had fled to the east and raised a massive army. They positioned themselves as defenders of the Republic against the tyranny of the Triumvirate. It would take a major military campaign, but the Triumvirs needed to eliminate this threat. In 42 BCE, Octavian and Antony led their forces east to confront the Liberators, as the assassins called themselves. The two sides met at Philippi in Macedonia. There were actually two battles at Philippi, fought a few weeks apart. The first battle was inconclusive, with both sides claiming partial victories, but the second battle was decisive. The Triumvirs' forces crushed the Liberators. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide rather than be captured. The dream of restoring the old Republic died with them. After Philippi, the Triumvirs divided up the Roman world. Antony took the wealthy eastern provinces. Lepidus got Africa. Octavian got the west, including Italy and Gaul. On paper, this seemed like Antony got the better deal. The east was richer and more stable, but Octavian's position in Italy would prove to be more valuable in the long run. He was at the center of Roman politics, while Antony was far away. Octavian's first major challenge was dealing with the aftermath of the civil wars. Italy was in chaos. Veterans needed land, but giving them land meant confiscating property from Italian landowners. This made Octavian extremely unpopular. There were protests and even armed resistance. One of the people who lost property was the poet Virgil, though he would later become one of Octavian's greatest propagandists. Then Octavian faced a military challenge from an unexpected source. Antony's wife, Fulvia, and his brother Lucius raised an army against Octavian. They claimed they were defending the rights of Italian landowners, but really this was a power play by Antony's family. Octavian besieged them at Perusia and eventually forced them to surrender. He showed mercy to Lucius, but had many of his supporters executed. Fulvia fled to Greece, where she died shortly after. This conflict, known as the Perusian War, showed that the Triumvirate was already fracturing. Antony returned from the east and met with Octavian at Brundisium in 40 BCE. War seemed imminent, but they managed to negotiate a new agreement. To seal the deal, Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia. This was pure political calculation on both sides. Antony's previous wife had just died, and this marriage would bind the two leaders together. For a while, it worked. The marriage produced two daughters and seemed to stabilize the relationship between the two most powerful men in Rome. Meanwhile, Octavian had another problem. Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great, had seized control of Sicily and was disrupting Rome's grain supply. This was a serious threat. Rome depended on imported grain, and Sextus was using his naval power to blockade shipments. Octavian tried to defeat Sextus militarily, but failed repeatedly. His general Marcus Agrippa finally turned things around. Agrippa was a military genius, and he would become Octavian's most trusted ally. After several years of fighting, Agrippa's fleet defeated Sextus at the Battle of Naulochus in 36 BCE. Sextus fled east, where he was eventually captured and executed. The victory over Sextus Pompey had an unexpected benefit for Octavian. Lepidus, who had helped in the campaign, tried to claim Sicily for himself. He demanded that Octavian hand over the province. This was a huge miscalculation. Octavian simply walked into Lepidus's camp and convinced his soldiers to switch sides. Just like that, Lepidus was out. The triumvirate was now down to 2. Octavian let Lepidus live, but stripped him of all power except his position as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Lepidus would live for another 24 years in comfortable but powerless retirement. Now it was just Octavian and Antony was making some very questionable decisions in the east. After his marriage to Octavia, Antony had returned to the eastern provinces. There he renewed his relationship with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. This wasn't new. Antony and Cleopatra had been involved since 41 BCE, and they had 3 children together. But now Antony seemed to be going all in on his relationship with the Egyptian queen. Antony launched a disastrous military campaign against Parthia. This was Rome's great enemy in the east, and Antony wanted to succeed where Caesar and Crassus had failed. But the campaign was a disaster. Antony lost thousands of men and had to retreat in humiliation. He became increasingly dependent on Cleopatra's financial support to maintain his position. Back in Rome, Octavian was working hard to consolidate his power and improve his image. He had a major advantage. He controlled Rome itself and could shape public opinion. He started a propaganda campaign against Antony, portraying him as a degenerate who had abandoned Roman values for Eastern luxury and a foreign queen. The propaganda painted Antony as weak, controlled by a woman, and no longer truly Roman. In 32 BCE, Antony divorced Octavia. This was exactly what Octavian had been waiting for. The divorce was a public insult to Octavian and his family, and it gave him the perfect excuse to turn public opinion completely against Antony. Octavian claimed that Antony had betrayed Rome and was planning to move the capital to Alexandria. He said that Antony intended to make Cleopatra the queen of the Roman Empire. Octavian did something dramatic to prove his point. He illegally seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins, who were supposed to keep such documents sacred and secret. Octavian read the will publicly in the Senate. According to Octavian, the will proved that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra, and that he recognized his children with Cleopatra as legitimate heirs. Whether this was actually in the will or whether Octavian fabricated parts of it, we'll never know. But it had the desired effect. The Senate was outraged. They stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. This was clever propaganda. Officially, this wasn't a civil war between Romans. This was Rome defending itself against a foreign queen who had seduced one of Rome's leaders. All of Italy and the western provinces swore an oath of loyalty to Octavian personally. This oath would later become the legal foundation for Octavian's power. In 31 BCE, Octavian and Agrippa led their forces east to confront Antony and Cleopatra. The two sides built up their armies and navies on the western coast of Greece. Antony had a larger army, but Octavian had Agrippa, who was the better commander. For months, the two sides maneuvered for position. Agrippa used his superior naval tactics to cut off Antony's supply lines. Antony's forces began to suffer from disease and desertion. Finally, on September 2, 31 BCE, the decisive battle took place at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. The battle was primarily naval. Antony and Cleopatra had about 230 ships, while Agrippa commanded around 400 smaller, more maneuverable vessels. The battle didn't go well for Antony from the start. Agrippa's ships were faster and more agile. They surrounded and destroyed many of Antony's larger vessels. In the middle of the battle, something strange happened. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships suddenly broke away and fled south toward Egypt. Antony, seeing this, abandoned his own flagship and followed Cleopatra. This decision sealed his fate. Without their commander, Antony's remaining forces fought on for a while but eventually surrendered. Antony's army, camped nearby on land, also surrendered shortly after when they learned what had happened. Why did Antony flee? Historians have debated this for 2,000 years. Some say it was part of a planned retreat. Others say Antony panicked or couldn't bear to be separated from Cleopatra. Whatever the reason, the Battle of Actium was over and Octavian had won. It wasn't the most dramatic battle in Roman history. There was no great last stand, no heroic sacrifice. Antony just left and his forces gave up. But the consequences would be enormous. Octavian didn't immediately pursue Antony and Cleopatra. He spent the next several months securing his position, dealing with his own mutinous troops who wanted to be paid and discharged, and preparing for the final confrontation. He finally invaded Egypt in 30 BCE. Antony tried to defend Alexandria, but his forces were defeated easily. Many of his soldiers deserted to Octavian. Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had committed suicide. Devastated, he stabbed himself with his sword, but the report was wrong. Cleopatra was still alive, barricaded in her mausoleum. Antony was carried to her while he was dying, and he died in her arms. It was a tragic end for a man who had been one of Rome's greatest generals. Cleopatra tried to negotiate with Octavian. She hoped she might be able to maintain some power or at least protect her children. But Octavian had no interest in negotiating. He wanted Egypt's wealth, and he wanted to parade Cleopatra through Rome in his triumph. Realizing she had no options, Cleopatra committed suicide. The famous story is that she used a poisonous snake, an asp, but the truth is we don't really know how she died. What matters is that she chose death over humiliation. Octavian had Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, with Julius Caesar, executed. He couldn't allow any rival claims to Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra's children with Antony were spared and sent to Rome to be raised by Octavia, Antony's former wife. Egypt was annexed as a Roman province, but it was special. It became Octavian's personal property, and no senator was allowed to visit without his permission. The wealth of Egypt would fund everything Octavian did next. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BCE as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He celebrated 3 triumphs over 3 days, showcasing his victories in Illyria, at Actium, and in Egypt. These were massive celebrations, with parades, games, and distributions of money to the citizens. Octavian wanted everyone to know that the civil wars were over and that he had brought peace. But Octavian faced a major problem. He had all the power, but how could he keep it without appearing to be a tyrant? Julius Caesar had been assassinated because he seemed to want to be king. The Senate and the Roman people hated the idea of monarchy. Octavian needed to find a way to maintain his power while preserving the appearance of the Republic. His solution was brilliant. In 27 BCE, Octavian appeared before the Senate and made a great show of returning all his powers to them. He said the Republic was restored and he was just a citizen again. Of course, this was theater. The Senate, packed with his supporters and terrified of more civil war, immediately begged him to remain in charge. They gave him a 10-year command over the provinces where most of Rome's legions were stationed. This meant he controlled the army. They also gave him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a religious title, not a political one, which made it seem less threatening. Augustus, as we should now call him, had effectively become Rome's first emperor, but he never used that title. He called himself princeps, meaning first citizen. He claimed he was just the most prominent senator, not a king or dictator. He carefully maintained all the traditional offices and procedures of the Republic. Consuls were still elected. The Senate still met, but everyone knew where the real power lay. Over the next several years, Augustus consolidated his position. He reduced the size of the army from over 50 legions to 28, settling the veterans in colonies throughout the empire. This served multiple purposes. It reduced the financial burden, eliminated potential troublemakers, and spread Roman culture to the provinces. He reformed the tax system, making it more efficient and less corrupt. He established a permanent civil service to administer the empire. Augustus also worked hard on his public image. He lived relatively modestly, at least by the standards of Rome's elite. He promoted traditional Roman values, duty, piety, family. He passed laws encouraging marriage and childbearing among the upper classes. He rebuilt temples and promoted religious observance. He patronized poets like Virgil and Horace, who wrote works glorifying Rome and Augustus's role in bringing peace. In 23 BCE, Augustus faced a serious illness that nearly killed him. This forced him to think about succession. He had no sons, so he began grooming his nephew Marcellus as his heir. But Marcellus died suddenly in 23 BCE. Augustus then turned to his trusted general Agrippa, marrying him to his daughter Julia. Agrippa and Julia had several children, and Augustus adopted the 2 oldest boys, Gaius and Lucius, as his own sons and heirs. Augustus also made constitutional adjustments in 23 BCE. He gave up the consulship, which he had held continuously, but received tribunician power for life. This gave him the authority to propose legislation and veto any action. He also received a special grant of imperium that made his authority superior to any provincial governor. These powers, renewed and expanded over time, became the constitutional basis of imperial power for centuries. The period after Actium became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in decades, there were no civil wars. The provinces were relatively stable. Trade flourished. Augustus expanded the empire's borders, conquering new territories in Spain, the Alps, and along the Danube. He tried to expand into Germany, but suffered a devastating defeat in 9 CE when 3 legions were destroyed in the Teutoburg forest. After that, Augustus decided the empire was large enough and focused on consolidating what Rome already had. Augustus ruled for over 40 years after Actium. He transformed Rome from a republic torn apart by civil war into a stable empire. He created the governmental system that would last for centuries. When he died in 14 CE at the age of 75, he had been the dominant figure in Roman politics for nearly 50 years. The Senate officially deified him, making him a god. His adopted son, Tiberius, succeeded him, establishing the principle of imperial succession. Looking back, we can see that Augustus was incredibly successful. He achieved what Julius Caesar could not. He ended the Republic and established one-man rule, but he did it in a way that most Romans accepted. He understood that Romans would tolerate autocracy as long as it was disguised as something else. He gave them the forms of the Republic while taking all the substance of power for himself. But we should also recognize the cost. The Roman Republic, with all its flaws and dysfunction, was over. The political competition and debate that had characterized Roman public life was replaced by the will of one man. The Senate became a rubber stamp. Elections became meaningless. The price of peace and stability was freedom. Augustus himself was aware of this tension. In his autobiography, The Res Gesti, which was inscribed on bronze pillars after his death, he carefully presented himself as the restorer of the Republic, not its destroyer. He listed all the honors the Senate had given him, all the powers they had begged him to accept. He emphasized that he had never held any office contrary to ancestral tradition. It was all technically true, but it was also fundamentally misleading. The transformation from Octavian to Augustus, from a teenage heir to the first emperor, took decades. It required military victory, political skill, ruthless elimination of rivals, and careful management of public opinion. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was the decisive moment, but it was just one step in a long process. Augustus spent the rest of his life consolidating what he won that day, building a system that would outlast him by centuries.